So today is about the talking about the iPhone as a serious camera. And for me, I've been using the iPhone more and more over the years. At first, because well, it just happened to be on me all the time, and I'm a photographer, like all of you are, and so I was interested in using it as a camera. And we use it like we all use it for snapshots and daily picture taking and quick things, right? Never really thinking about it as having potential alongside our serious DSLRs. And then a couple of years ago, that started to change, I think, as the camera became much more powerful. We got RAW capability. We started to get better apps that allowed us to take advantage of the hardware in the camera. And of course, Apple keeps improving the camera every year. Now, if you don't have an iPhone, I know not everyone has one. You may be using a Pixel phone or some other phone from Android. I'm talking about the iPhone because primarily that's what I use. I'm kind of an Apple person, and so that's what I'm most familiar with. If you don't have one, that's fine. Some of the things will be not apply to you perhaps, but I always try to express and share my ideas from a more conceptual, broad standpoint. So I don't want to tell you specifically do this or do that. I'm not a formula type of guy. You guys know that already. It's really about the ideas, and maybe you can borrow some of the things that are specific to the iPhone and apply them to your phone. We'll also get into a little bit Lightroom in terms of syncing images and kind of the workflow, but I can't get into that too much. It's all a bit in depth, and I don't want this webinar to go on forever. So I'm just going to give you the basics on that. We've covered this much more in depth in the Academy. So if that's something that you're interested in, you can always check that out. The Creative Path Academy. So to get started, hey Mark, and hi Pierre, great to see you. Larry, Howard, Eileen, Rich, Linda, Michael, Robert Miller, welcome all again. All right, so I'll get started. Thank you guys. Really appreciate you guys being here. And yeah, let's get going. So I just want to start off a little bit about talking about why I think the iPhone is a great tool and how I've been using it. For me, all cameras are tools. The iPhone is no different. I don't think of it as a replacement or taking over or better or necessarily worse. It's just a complement to my cameras. I still love my DSLRs, all the way going back to my Canon 1DS Mark III that I bought in 2008. But again, this is just another tool. And I think we should be using all of our tools to improve our skills, to stay engaged photographically, right? One of the biggest challenges that we have, of course, is staying motivated. And when we don't want to go out when it's cold, we go through peaks and valleys in terms of our excitement about photography. And this is just another way, I think, to remain engaged. Maybe you don't want to carry a backpack, but you're out on a walk with your dog. You got your phone. That's me all the time. And I see something interesting, I will use it to make a picture. And if I know that that picture has the potential to be really good quality, potentially to print it out, then I'm going to be more serious about it. I think that just keeps us more engaged. I'm going to give you 5 or 6 reasons why I think the iPhone is really useful. The first one is portability and accessibility, right? As I said, it's always on us. You've all heard that great quote, the best camera is the one that you have with you. And we always have our iPhones with us for the most part, for security, for messaging, for being in contact. It's a phone. And so if you have it on you, you don't have your regular camera, it's always going to be available. This picture that you see here is on my iPhone 11. I was on a workshop years ago, didn't have my quote unquote serious camera, but I had a little break between students doing their thing. I saw this beautiful picture and I said, sure, this beautiful scene. And I said, let me see what I can do with this. And that really got me started, because when I brought it back home and I brought it up in Lightroom and I even printed it, I was really impressed with what I was able to achieve. And that's when I said, wow, this really is more than just a kind of a snapshot, quick grab camera. Second reason is discreetness. Of course, it's small. You can take it anywhere at any time, particularly if you feel a bit insecure about carrying your expensive camera. I know I've heard on workshops, I've heard from a lot of women that tell me that they are a bit nervous sometimes. Even men as well. I've been nervous sometimes by myself, deep in the woods somewhere that wasn't like a natural park, but maybe somewhere local, and wasn't sure who was around. But particularly if you're a little bit more afraid, then this perhaps gives you a bit of safety, because people don't see you walking around with an expensive camera, tripod, all those kinds of things, which can always call attention to you. Another reason is learning composition without distractions. This is probably my favorite reason, because whenever we are taking a picture, whenever you're imposing a frame on the scene, whether it's landscape, urban, a person, whatever it is, whenever you're imposing this frame, creating essentially a composition, that is composition. That's how we learn composition. And the more you practice this, the better you get at it. And anytime you get a chance to practice composition, I think is always going to be useful. And the best thing about it is you can apply this back to your regular camera. So I'm constantly walking around. Whenever I see something interesting, I'll take up my phone and just think about, hey, how would I make a interesting composition here? And that's practice. That's training your eye. That is becoming more sensitive to the things that are happening around you. If you only are doing that when you've got your serious camera, you're missing out, I think, on a lot of opportunity there. So that's another key reason. Another reason is similar to the others, getting out of your comfort zone. When you've got an iPhone, it's very easy to get it into positions that you normally wouldn't do with a regular camera, or it's a little more difficult. It's easy to get it into different situations that perhaps you might not have done with your regular camera, because it's maybe something you're not comfortable doing or used to doing, or you haven't thought of that. But you can put your camera, you can put it underneath a rock, you can put it underneath a branch, you can put it in places that a little bit more difficult to do with a regular camera. And I think there's something about the idea that because you're not using your serious camera, you're willing to take more chances. You should be doing that with your regular camera anyway. But there's something about, well, it's going to be a throwaway picture and it's not something that I need to be serious about. That allows you, I think, to be a little more free. I think that feeling of being free, of being more willing to try different things, is something that you should embody with whatever camera you're using, not just with your iPhone. It just tends to be easier when you've got a mobile phone for some reason. Again, maybe because we're not taking ourselves as seriously as when we've got our multi-$1,000 gear or kit. So that's another reason, getting out of the comfort zone, pushing ourselves to explore things that I think help you to grow, to become a better photographer. Another thing about the iPhone that's interesting, and this is now more exclusive to the iPhone itself, it's that the technology built into the iPhone, particularly the latest models. I have an iPhone 15 Pro, but now we've got the 16, even the 14, and even the 13. They keep adding a lot of capability to it through things like machine learning, through things like computational photography, and allows you to do things with a phone that are actually very difficult to do with a regular camera. For example, night mode. If you're in a scene where the exposure is very, very low, where on a regular camera you typically might be looking at a 2 or 3 second exposure, well, what the iPhone does is that it'll take multiple pictures and blend them all together to give you an image that looks like it's a long exposure. It doesn't give you the sense that things are moving in the scene, but it allows you to capture a sharp image without much camera shake, without having to put the camera on a tripod, essentially. So you're able to get night images that typically on a regular camera, they'd be blurry unless you were in a tripod. Or things like portrait mode, where you can instantly engage portrait mode and it automatically blurs out the background to give you a beautiful portrait, something that you would have to switch to a different lens for in a regular camera, one with a pretty large aperture. The other thing about the portrait mode in the iPhone is that you can adjust the depth of field and the focus point after the fact when you're editing the image. So in this picture here, I could actually make the focus point the wall back here if I wanted to, in which case her face would be blurry. Or I can adjust the amount of aperture after the fact, so I can make the back softer and blurrier, or less blurry, and essentially changing the depth of field. That's something that, as far as I know, you cannot do after the fact with any traditional DSLR or mirrorless camera. And you don't only have to do this in the iPhone app, you can actually do this in Lightroom as well through what's called a depth map. And with pictures that you shoot on the iPhone that have this capability, this depth map built in, you'll see actually a little, you'll be able to access that in Lightroom. You'll have a new checkbox that says depth map. You turn that on and it'll actually allow you to adjust the depth of field, similar to the lens blur effect. You also get HDR built in. I'm not sure if cameras, I think most cameras, mirrorless and DSLRs, will allow you to shoot DSLR, but it's 3 separate images or 5 or however many images you make in terms of the HDR. The iPhone will blend them all together at one time, so you get one RAW file, and then again you can adjust the HDR afterwards in Lightroom or other apps. And as I mentioned before at the beginning, the more you engage with photography, the better photographer you're going to come. So anything that I think helps you to engage, helps you to become more curious about photography and more excited about it, I think it's a plus. And so if this is just another thing that you can do that because as I said before, it's ubiquitous, it's always on you, then I think that's always a good thing. And finally, with shooting in RAW, and I mean, I've gone back as far as the iPhone 11 and made prints, but if we're looking at the current phones and 16 and the iPhone 15, where we are generating RAW files anywhere from 24 to 48 megapixels, that is more than enough resolution to make prints. And I've made many prints from my iPhone images that look spectacular. I mean, I've even showed them to folks and had them decide or ask them to select which one was the iPhone print and which one was the DSLR print. No one can tell. In fact, many times people would say that the DSLR print was the iPhone one because the iPhone one was maybe a little bit sharper or maybe just looked a little bit cleaner, if you will. So again, not a replacement, just another tool that really gives you almost all of the capabilities. Now, there are some disadvantages, of course. I think you guys know that already. Things like lens choices, and if you need fast shutter speeds or fast focusing, to do sports and things like that, absolutely, a DSLR is going to be far superior for those kinds of things. But a lot of times, it's just kind of the walking around thing. You're walking around, wherever the case might be. It's more of a casual thing where I think it can really help you, again, to practice perhaps photography on a regular daily basis, and that really leads to improvement over time. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about setting up your iPhone properly so that you can get this best quality. Just a couple of things I want to explain about file formats in iOS. So this is going to be specific to Apple products, iOS, iPhone. This is also, this applies to iPads as well, but we're talking about the iPhone here. In iOS, you essentially have 4 different file types that the camera can produce. There's HEIF. Actually, let's start with JPEG because that's the one that we're most familiar with. Of course, it'll shoot JPEG. That's a compressed image, and that's going to be most compatible. But Apple introduced a new format a couple years ago called HEIF, which essentially gives you a smaller file with the same or better quality as a JPEG. So it's basically a better version, an improved version, if you will, of JPEG. And the HEIF format also saves that depth image that depth map, that I mentioned before. So if you use portrait mode, that's the format that you have to make the photo in order to have that depth map, so that then you can go ahead and adjust the focus point and or the aperture depth of field afterwards. Now you can also photograph in RAW, and there are 2 RAW formats that the iPhone supports. Once again, there's RAW, just basic RAW. That's the one that we're all familiar with. That's the one that all DSLRs and mirrorless cameras can capture. That's essentially the native RAW information from the camera sensor without anything adjusted to it, nothing done to it whatsoever. The iPhone can shoot in RAW, But Apple also introduced their own version of RAW called ProRAW. And ProRAW is essentially what they're doing with ProRAW is they're giving you most of the editing capabilities of RAW, but they are applying a little bit of processing, their computational processing. So it adds a little bit of sharpness, maybe a little bit of improved exposure or improved color, things like that. So it's not a pure RAW file. It's called ProRAW, and there are some differences between RAW and ProRAW that you need to understand. The main difference is, I would say, at the start, is that if you're using the built-in app on your camera, that's the built-in camera app, it only shoots in ProRAW. You cannot set the built-in camera to shoot in just RAW. It always uses ProRAW. That's Apple's format, and so they've made it so that the built-in camera app, the one that all the iPhones come with, that we probably use most of the time, that would only shoot in ProRAW. It'll shoot in HEIF or JPEG as well, but in terms of the RAW formats, that's the only one it supports. With the ProRAW format, you can get up to 48 megapixel files, depending on the lens that you're using. It's as I said, a slightly processed 10-bit RAW file. You get 48 megapixels, but usually that's only with the standard 1x lens, so that's the standard wide-angle lens. Usually it's 24 millimeters. With the other lenses, particularly as you start zooming in, on the iPhone 15 Pro, for example, I've got 3 lenses. The second lens and the third lens, those will come down to either 12 or 24 megapixels. But the ProRAW file is saved as a DNG file. So it is, again, a RAW file in terms of the format. It's just got this slight amount of processing added to it. 2 little things about the ProRAW format, and that is that if you use the portrait mode on your phone, you don't have access to ProRAW. So the portrait mode is only available in HEIF or JPEG. But the problem with JPEG, as I said before, is if you shoot in JPEG with the portrait mode, you're not going to get the depth map that allows you to adjust the focal point and the depth of field afterwards. So you want to use, you want to set it to HEIF when you're not using RAW, and I'll show you how to do that in the phone in the settings in a moment. And also the ProRAW is only available on iPhone 12 or later. So if you've got an iPhone 12 up to the current ones, you have ProRAW. Now there's also RAW that's completely unprocessed, and sometimes that can be useful. If you don't want Apple to apply any processing at all, you may want a straight RAW file. Now, that's, as I said, that's only available in third-party apps, such as the Lightroom app. So if you install the Lightroom app on your phone, the camera in the Lightroom app doesn't shoot in ProRAW. It only shoots straight RAW. It gives you access to that. Now, the RAW format, or the straight RAW format, is 12 megapixels maximum. Okay, so you don't get 48 megapixels. You don't even get 24. It's 12 megapixels maximum with straight RAW. It's also saved as a DNG file. So you would think, well, I should probably use ProRAW most of the time, perhaps, but there are some instances where you may want to use RAW instead. Again, if you don't want the processing engine in the to apply any effects to the image, then you may want to go with ProRAW directly. Another reason why I like to use RAW in the Lightroom app is that I prefer the look of the HDR mode in the Lightroom app over the ProRAW. The ProRAW tends to be, you don't really get an option for HDR. It kind of selects on its own based on the situation. And I find it tends to be a little bit more aggressive, whereas with RAW, if I know that I want to use HDR, for example, you have a very wide dynamic range in a scene, lots of highlights and shadows, bright sunny day, whatever the case might be, then I will typically use the Lightroom app, set it to HDR mode, and that'll give me an HDR file, one file, but then when I import it into Lightroom, I can adjust it and get the look that I want. With ProRAW, you don't really get an HDR mode. You sort of have to live with what Apple gives you. So it's one of those things, honestly, that you're going to have to experiment with and play with a little bit to decide which one you want to use. The easiest way to switch between the two, ProRAW or RAW, is If you use the built-in camera app, that'll be in ProRAW all the time. Actually, it'll be in ProRAW or HEIF, in case you don't want to shoot RAW and you just want to make, let's say you're taking a screenshot of something, or you want to photograph, some mundane thing, then you don't use ProRAW for that. You just set it to HEIF. That's like just normally making a quick snapshot. But if you set it to ProRAW or you enable ProRAW, then the built-in camera app will always be in ProRAW. If you want to shoot in RAW, then you just use the Lightroom app instead. And you open up that app and you use the camera in there. In either case, whether you're shooting in ProRAW or RAW, either one of those files can be imported into Lightroom. Of course, when you use the Lightroom app, it's already inside of the Lightroom app. And if you have a subscription, then it'll sync to the cloud. If you are using the built-in camera app, then you can import that image into Lightroom, and that'll also sync to the cloud. So either way, for example, in terms of a final destination, perhaps the final destination is your Lightroom Classic catalog, and you want to have all of your iPhone images wind up in your Classic catalog. Whether you use the built-in app or whether you use Lightroom or any other third-party app, they can all wind up in Lightroom in your Classic catalog. And I'll go through basics of how to make sure that works. Okay, so at this point, let's jump into the phone, and I'll show you how to get some of these settings set up. Let's see, my phone should be coming up here. Okay, give me 1 second here. Of course, it was working before I went live, and now it's not. When in doubt, unplug, then plug back in. There we go. Okay. So to get this set up, the first thing you want to do is you want to go inside your settings. And I'm just going to back out here because I was already in my settings in the submenus. But you go into the main settings, and then you want to scroll down to camera. And I'm going to tap on camera. And then inside of camera, you're going to see several options here. And one of them says formats right there. You want to tap formats. And then in formats at the top, first you'll see whether you want to capture using the high efficiency mode, that's the HEIF file type, or most compatible is going to be JPEG. So you see I have mine set to HEIF. That means that when I'm not shooting in RAW, it's going to capture in HEIF, which is, again, just as small as JPEG, if not smaller, but it gives me the depth map. So that's kind of the default file format. Below that, you see photo mode, and you want to make sure that this is set to the highest that your camera provides. So for me, the highest is 24 megapixels. All right, and this is basically the sensor before Apple adds its processing to give you the 48 megapixel file. So you want to set this to whatever the greatest is for your camera. And in my case, I have mine set to 24 megapixels. And then below that, you see that you have another option, ProRAW and resolution control. And you want that to be checked on. What that does is that it allows you to enable ProRAW when you open up the camera app. Okay? And someone asks, is this in 16 only? No, I'm on my iPhone 15. This is also the case in, I would say, as far back as 13. So 13, 14, even 12, I think. I mentioned before, ProRAW has been available in 12. So if my memory serves me correct, this is the case in 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16, of course. But I'm on an iPhone 15 Pro right now. And then below resolution control, you see there is another section there, Pro Default. And if you tap that, you'll see that you have some options here. So you have HEIF Max, you have ProRAW 12 megapixels, or ProRAW Max up to 48 megapixels. And again, I have mine set to 48 megapixels. That's going to give you the very best quality, very best quality out of your files. Now, Lynn is saying I'm not seeing anything but efficient or compatible in my 14. Well, again, just make sure that by the way, let me just say this also. I'm almost sure this is specific to Pro models. So if you've just got an iPhone 14, in fact, I think my son has an iPhone 14. He doesn't have these options. So these are all Pro features. So iPhone 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16 Pro. Only Pro versions have this. That's why they call it ProRAW. All right. So if you don't have a Pro version, sorry about that. You can still, by the way, you can still get RAW with the Lightroom app. So it's not like you can't shoot RAW at all. But these are the Apple ProRAW settings. Okay. So again, ProRAW default here. Just make sure that when I tap that, it's set to ProRAW Max 48 megapixels. And that's pretty much all you need to do. The last section at the bottom there, it's ProRes. That's for video, so no need to worry about that. Now, one other setting that you might want to check here is if I back out one submenu there. So I was in formats. I'm going to tap the top where it says camera, and I back out here to the main settings. You'll see another setting here called preserve settings right there. And that one is pretty important. If I tap that, you'll see a bunch of toggles, basically on-off toggles is what they are. And what this does is that this allows the built-in camera app to remember the setting for the camera for the camera, so that when you next open it, it keeps that same setting. So for example, if you see at the top, I have camera mode enabled. What that means is that whatever mode I'm in when I'm using the camera app, so for example, if I switch to portrait mode and then I close my phone, I shut it down or I put it in my pocket or whatever the case might be, and then when I open it again and I open up the built-in camera app, it's going to stay in portrait mode. It's going to reopen again in portrait mode. If I turn that off, then it's not going to remember, and it may go back to some other mode, or it may go back to the default mode. So this allows it to remember to preserve the previous use case settings. And I find this very useful for some things because I want it to go back to that same setting. So for example, you see that most of mine are the creative mode, the camera mode is turned on. So I wanted to remember what mode I'm in. So when I open it again, it's the same one. A lot of these other ones are turned off for me. So exposure adjustment is turned on. That one is pretty critical. So that means that let's say you're taking a picture and you've set your exposure to underexposed by a half stop because you're in a situation and you want, you want to adjust your exposure. Well, if you just take a few pictures and then put your camera away, or you just take a break and your iPhone turns off and then you turn it back on again, you want it to remember those exposure settings. Otherwise, when you go to take the same picture, potentially you're still photographing the same thing. It's going to reset the exposure back to 0. Imagine if on your DSLR or on your mirrorless camera, it always reset the exposure, right? You want it to remember where it was, so then you can continue to photograph that same situation until you're ready to move on. So that's where that exposure adjustment, I have that enabled for preserve settings. Everything else I have off, but here's the two important ones at the bottom for me. One is ProRAW and resolution control. This means that if I set the camera to capture in ProRAW, once again, if I turn my camera off, I turn my iPhone off, and then I open up the iPhone again, I want it to stay in ProRAW. And vice versa, if I'm not in ProRAW, in HEIF, I want it to stay that way also. This way, I don't want to be fooled into thinking that I am shooting in ProRAW when in fact it reverted back to HEIF. And this is easy to think about when you're sort of practicing at home, but you know how it is when you're out there in the field and lots of things are going on and you're excited about what you're looking at. You kind of forget these things. And the last one, live photo. I do not use live photo at all. That's the feature where the phone will capture like maybe a brief second or two of video before the actual picture. I have that turned off, and I have it to remember that it's turned off. So that's why I have live photo enabled. What that means is that it's going to remember or preserve that setting. The setting is, if I turn it off, leave it off. That's what this means here. Preserve whatever setting you set for these particular things, okay? So I hope that's useful there in terms of preserve settings. And you can, play with these and set these up in whatever way works best for you. These are the ones that tend to work best for me. And every once in a while, I'll come and make an adjustment here, but these tend to be kind of standard. A couple of other things I want to show you very quickly on the phone. That is, if you've got, and forgive me, I don't remember exactly which models of the phones have this, but I know starting with the iPhone 15, perhaps the 15 Pro, the 15 Pro and the 16 have a dedicated button on the side. So it's the button above the volume button. Now I know that the iPhone 16 also has a dedicated shutter button, but the 15 Pros have a button above the two volume buttons that's called an action button. And you can assign this button to anything you want. It's basically customizable. So if I go up, if I back out to the main settings again, and you see right here, action button. When I tap that, that's what the button looks like, kind of. It's on the side of the phone. And you can set this button, as I said, to do anything you want. So if I scroll here left and right, for example, you could set it to enable silent mode on your phone, or focus mode, or there's one that's kind of interesting. You can set it to camera. So that means that instead of you, let's say you're out and about, instead of you having to swipe up on your phone and then tap the camera icon to open up the camera app, pressing that button automatically opens up the camera app and gets you ready to take a photograph. So that's a really cool shortcut to just get into shooting mode faster and easier. So that's one there. If I keep going, there's flashlight, and I've been tempted to switch it to flashlight because I use that feature a whole lot. Voice memo, recognizable music, controls. Actually, the controls is the one that I wanted. If you set it to controls, this allows you to set it to open any other app that also has this function enabled. And you'll notice that I have this set to Pro Camera. Pro Camera is a third-party app that I also use for photography, and that app has it has the ability to assign it to the action button. So if I tap here in the bottom where it says Pro Camera, you can see that this shows me now all of the apps on my phone that have this feature enabled that I can use for this action button. And even Lightroom is there. You see Lightroom there, and there's some other things, notes, but there's Pro Camera. So if I select Pro Camera, now I have it set to Pro Camera. So for me right now, you can see that for the most part, that button for me opens up Pro Camera. That's the app that I like to use to capture images. It's more of an advanced, it's got some more advanced features. Quality is the same, but it's got some other features that the built-in camera app doesn't have. So that's what I'm using that for. Now, let's say you are not using, let's say you don't have the action button on the side. Your particular model of the phone doesn't have the action button. What you can do also is you can set a widget to your home screen that also will open up the Lightroom app if you have it installed, for example. So you'll see here that I have the Lightroom app installed right there. But if I turn my phone, if I lock the screen like this, and then I tap the side to turn it on, if I then tap and hold my home screen like that, you'll see that I can now customize my, I'm sorry, it's not the home screen, it's the lock screen. Okay, this is the lock screen. Before you've actually done the Face ID to get in, this is the lock screen. If I tap customize at the bottom, then it allows you to customize the lock screen or the home screen. If I tap on lock screen on the left, now you'll see that I have the option to place different widgets on the lock screen. And you'll see that right here, I have the Lightroom icon. So the way this works is, if I tap it like that, you'll see that now you can only put 2 widgets in the top area. You see they have the little minus sign. So I'm going to actually press the minus sign to delete or remove the Lightroom app like that. And now it's gone. So let's say I want to add this. I'm in your situation, perhaps if you don't have this, I want to add this a widget for the Lightroom app. So that I only have to do is tap that on the lock screen to open up the Lightroom app. I'm going to tap that area again. I'm going to tap it around here to tell it that I want to put something there. And now you see, again, I get this window that pops up allowing me to add widgets. And if I scroll down, there's Lightroom. I'll tap Lightroom and it tells me what this widget will do. And it says take a photo. So I'm going to select that widget and now it's added to my home screen. And then at the very top, right there, you have to click on done so it remembers this. And that's my lock screen. Now, if I swipe up on this lock screen, then it's going to do the Face ID and let me in the phone. But before I do that, if I just, I'm gonna press this button on the side to turn it off, press the button to turn it on the side, and I'm gonna tap that Lightroom icon, and boom, I'm already right inside my Lightroom app, ready to take a picture. This is the Lightroom app, not the built-in camera app. And the little yellow you see behind is just a piece of a sticky note that I put on the phone so that you're not looking at my computer desk. Okay, just something to block the lens. All right, so that's another shortcut. In case you don't have that physical action button on the side, that's a shortcut that allows you to get quickly into the phone, into the app to take a picture. Especially when you're out and about, you just want to get quickly there without having to scroll and look for the icon, those kinds of things. Dave asks, how did you get Pro Camera as a button option? So the Pro Camera app has to be installed. If it's installed, then it pops up as one of the options to add to the action button. So the action button is only going to show you apps that you have that you've installed on your phone. If it's not installed, then you're not going to see it there. But once you install it, it automatically shows up. You don't have to actually add or anything like that. If you still have it installed and you don't see that showing up, it's very possible that you may have to go into the Pro Camera app and maybe in the settings say enable the action button. That's possible. I don't really remember if I had to do it or not. It was a while back, but that's what I would check. Okay, so what I wanted to do now is I want to jump in the built-in camera app and just give you some quick, just a quick tour about some of the most important things you may want to use. So I'm going to press the camera app, the top left-hand side. That's the built-in camera app. And the most important thing I want to show you is that right here, that's where you switch between shooting in ProRAW and not ProRAW. And in my case, it's going to be HEIF, right? So when you notice that the ProRAW has a line through it, what that means is that right now, any pictures I make are going to be in the HEIF format. And that's when I don't want to shoot ProRAW. So that's going to be the smallest file size compressed. That's just everyday kinds of pictures and parties and celebrations, that kind of stuff, okay? But if I want to shoot in ProRAW, all I got to do is tap that ProRAW icon, and now you see the line goes away. And now what that means is that I am in ProRAW format, and any pictures that I make will be a DNG file. And because I have that setting set to be preserved, as I showed you before in the settings, that means that even if I leave the camera app and then I come back to it, it's still going to stay in the ProRAW format. So that's kind of important there. The other things you'll see is that on the top right, I have live photo turned off, and it's always going to be turned off because I set the preserve settings to remember that setting. And you'll also see that right here, you've got the exposure control, and that is telling you essentially whether you have exposure compensation set on or off. So typically the way you would take a picture, you just tap on the screen on something, it sets your exposure. But now that I've tapped on the screen to set my focus point, to set my focus point and my exposure, they're both at the same time. If I now tap and hold that little light icon up and down, like that, you can see that I can underexpose or overexpose. So that's underexposing, and that's overexposing. Now, this is a very sort of crude and rudimentary way to underexpose and overexpose for two reasons. One is you don't really see how much you're underexposing or overexposing by. And number two is if I underexpose like that, okay, and then I tap again on my screen to set a new focus point, it resets the exposure. So this is only going to work, if you don't reset your exposure, and only when you're using the camera that particular time. In other words, if I set the exposure and then underexpose, and then I close my phone and open it up again, it's going to reset that. Now, if you want to have a little more better control over exposure, I'm going to tap again to kind of zero it out. At the top here, you'll see what I showed you before, which is that exposure control. If I tap that, now you see at the bottom, right above the shutter button, I get a manual exposure control, like a little dial. And now I can underexpose by, a stop or a little more than a stop. I can go above a stop, But the cool thing here is that if I set it like that, so like overexposing by 7/10 of a stop, okay, it'll remember that. So regardless of where I tap on the screen, you notice that it's not setting my exposure. It's remembering my manual exposure setting. So you can think of that as a manual exposure setting when you tap that dial at the top. And, you know, to zero it out, just bring it back to 0 again. All right, so that's one of the most important things, is setting your exposure if you want to override the automatic exposure. Now, in the middle of the phone, you'll see here there's also a little triangle facing down. And if you tap that triangle, then it'll bring up some adjustments at the bottom, again, right above the shutter button. And so one of these here is, I'm going to tap on 4:3, and this allows you to set essentially the aspect ratio, so 16:9 or square or 4:3. But the native aspect ratio is 4:3. So even if you set it to 16:9, you're going to lose a little bit on the sides. And if you set it to square, of course, you're going to lose as well. So I did get a question from someone before the webinar started about which aspect ratio should I use. I say use the native aspect ratio, which is 4:3, and then you can always crop and adjust later on. Once again, if you press the plus and minus button, that's again the same exposure compensation to the right. So that gives you the same dial. Again, you can adjust the exposure compensation. And then I'm going to press that minus plus button to the left to come out of that. And you also have flash control on the left. These are more things that you probably won't be using, but the most important ones there are the exposure control, focusing, just tap on the screen. And then above that, of course, you've got your lens choices right here. And that's to select the different lenses. That'll be different depending on your phone, of course. So because this is the 15 Pro, I've got 3 physical lenses on the back of the camera. And just so that you're aware, in case you're into the technical stuff, each lens has its own sensor. So it's not just one sensor in the iPhone. Each lens has its own. So this phone actually has 3 separate digital sensors, one dedicated for each lens. If your camera has 2 lenses on the back, that's 2 sensors, etc. That's why, depending on the lens that you use, there's a different resolution capability, because it's a physically a different sensor. So that's pretty much it on the iPhone, I would say. If I tap that ProRAW Max again, then I'm back into HEIF mode. Now, let me jump into the Lightroom app. And that's right there to the right of my built-in camera app. When you jump into Lightroom, you may have a screen like this, okay, showing you your pictures, etc. And you'll notice at the bottom here, there are 2 kind of important buttons. The one on the left is the import button. So if you tap that import button, it actually allows you to import images from your camera roll. That's how you get your ProRAW images that you make with the built-in app into Lightroom. You basically tap that import button, and then you'll see at the bottom it says, where do you want to add photos from? Device, files, or connected camera card. The connected camera card, of course, that one is pretty self-explanatory. If you've got a DSLR that you want import images from, you just connect your camera card, the SD card, into some kind of device that allows you to import, and you could bring in your files from your camera. The one in the middle, files, that's perhaps files that you have on your phone itself. But if you want to import from your camera roll the images that you've made with your built-in camera app, you select the first one, device. And now this is showing you now my camera roll. So these are images that I've made with my built-in camera app. And a lot of them are, like you can see, I got screenshots and pictures of different things, but I do have potentially some raw files here. So for example, if you look at the very top, the first row, there's some mossy green on a rock. You see that they say DNG, right? A very, very tiny little icon there. It says DNG, and those are DNG files. Those are images that I made with my built-in camera app with ProRAW enabled. So I could select 4 images like that, those 5, let's say, actually 6. I select those, and at the bottom I tap add, and now it will import those images from my built-in camera app into Lightroom. And so you see now it says 6 photos imported, and there they are at the top. All right, so that's adding images into Lightroom. And very soon we'll talk about getting them into Classic. Now on the right here, you'll see another button with a little camera icon. And if you tap that button, that opens up the built-in camera app for Lightroom. And this one is kind of similar to the iPhone built-in app, but slightly different. So for example, the most important ones here is right here. That lets you set the mode that the camera is going to be in. So notice that it says HDR now. If I tap that HDR word, you'll see that I have 3 different modes there: automatic, professional, and high dynamic range. The difference between those 3 is automatic means you don't have any manual controls. Professional means you do have manual controls. You can adjust things like exposure and shutter speed to a very small degree. You can only adjust the shutter speed up to a second in length on the iPhone. You can't get any longer than that, at least natively. You can use some apps that do some tricks, but that's all you can do from a manual standpoint. And then you have high dynamic range, and high dynamic range is HDR. If I switch this back to professional like that, now you're in pro mode, and you see that at the bottom right here, I have all of my manual adjustments. And so I can tap somewhere on the screen, and that sets the focus point. If I want to adjust exposure, I tap the exposure, and I can adjust the exposure compensation up and down. I can tap on shutter speed right next to the right of it, and you see that it's set to auto now, or I can adjust this from, well, it doesn't really, oh, I'm so sorry, it shows it at the top. So shutter speed from 1/1600th of a second all the way up to 1 second. That's the maximum you get. So you can adjust shutter speed here manually, or if you drag it all the way to the left, then that's going to be auto shutter speed. To the right of that, I have ISO. You can also adjust the ISO, same way. Either leave it at auto, or I can drag it to the right, and at the top you see the readout. It's telling me ISO 1600, ISO 2000, etc. So I'm going to put this back to auto. You can adjust the white balance, auto white balance, or one of the built-in, tungsten or daylight or what have you. Remember that the white balance really is not that important when you're shooting in RAW, because you can always adjust it later. And if I didn't mention this before, this was in my head, remember that the Lightroom app always shoots in RAW. So there is no setting it to, actually, let me back up a minute. I'm sorry. That is incorrect. At the very top of the app, the reason I said it always shoots in RAW is because this is how I have it set automatically. But right here at the top, you tap that and you can see that you can switch it between DNG or JPEG. My mistake. But I have it set to DNG. It always stays there, and therefore it's always shooting in RAW. But you can set it to JPEG like that, in which case you're shooting a JPEG image. So the first thing you want to do is just go to the top, tap that, and set it to DNG like that. And then you're always going to be in RAW on the Lightroom app. This doesn't change it back or anything like that. Okay, and then you've got some other little functions at the bottom. You've got the lens choice here, ultra wide, telephoto, or wide. And that last icon there allows you to switch between different sort of looks, if you will. One cool thing about this, by the way, is that remember, you're shooting in RAW, and so regardless of what look you set this to, these are just sort of built-in presets that make it look a certain way, but you're still going to have a RAW file. You could set this to black and white like that, in which case you could actually go out with your camera and you could view whatever image you're looking at as it would look as a black and white, which is a great, I think, a good training tool to kind of help you to see more in black and white. And of course, when you import it into Lightroom, it's still going to have the color information because it's a RAW file. All right, so that's basically the how you would use the Lightroom app. There's also 3 little dots right here, and if you tap those 3 little dots, then you also get a little readout of all your adjustments. So again, the first one there is the ratio 4:3. The second one is a timer. If you tap that, you can actually enable a timer. So 2, 5, 10 seconds. You can turn on or turn off a grid or a level. Okay, you can have a level like this so that depending on how you rotate your phone, It's going to tell you whether it's level or not. Very useful. The other one here is a show highlight clipping indicator. So you can turn that on, and if something is clipping, you'll see it just like you see it on your regular camera. And I'm going to turn the highlight clipping off, and I'm going to also turn off the grid and the level. And then that last little asterisk there allows you to add some little features, like, for example, geotag photos. That means that whenever you take a picture, it'll add the location, the GPS location. Just looking at the questions here. So a couple of questions. One is, can you go over the device choices on the left in Lightroom app? I only have photos available. Sure. So when you go to photos right here, you should have these two buttons at the bottom. If you're, let's say you're in something like this where you're not seeing those buttons, you're in edit mode, you want to tap this little left triangle there to get you out of edit mode, get you back to the main window. So you want to be able to see this Lightroom icon. And on the main window, then you'll see these two buttons. So yes, if you like tap an image to go into the image, perhaps you want to do edits or things like that, then the camera app is going to go away because you're doing something different. So just tap that arrow in the top left to get you out of edit mode, take you back to the sort of the library module, if you will. That's the equivalent in Lightroom Classic, and then you'll see those two buttons at the bottom. Yes, the webinar will be available for recording later. Patrick asks, in the Lightroom mobile app, can you send your image to the camera roll on your phone and not the Lightroom cloud? So can you import an image, or can you export an image from so I'm not sure if the question is going from Lightroom to the camera roll or vice versa. You can send an image from Lightroom to the camera roll. So if I have this image selected like this, you're always going to have the share sheet or the share button right there. That's almost ubiquitous on every iOS app. You tap that share button, and then you can say share, and you can send copy to device. That would be your camera roll, or you can share it out on an iMessage or something like that. You can export it. So you have all kinds of export options in Lightroom. Now, if you're asking about importing an image into Lightroom from your camera roll, but preventing it from going to the cloud, I don't think that's possible. I think once you have a subscription, if you don't have a subscription, then I would guess it won't go to the cloud and you don't have that functionality. But if you do have a subscription, then it's automatically going to go to the cloud. You can always delete it from, well, I'm not sure you can delete it from the cloud, because then it would delete it entirely. So the cloud is your kind of storage mechanism for all the images you make with the Lightroom app, unless you're using Lightroom Classic. If you're using Lightroom Classic, then you can download them to Lightroom Classic, delete them from the cloud, and now you have your image. And I'll show you that very briefly before we run out of time. I'm just looking at questions here. Okay, so I think I answered that for Patrick. If I didn't, or if you need some clarification, just post it in there, Patrick, and I'll see that. I saw it in both areas, but put it in the questions area. Thank you. Okay, so that's essentially kind of a rundown of the two apps. Now, I did want to mention just briefly about the Lightroom Classic functionality. So if I switch over to Lightroom Classic, let me get over here. Okay, if I switch over to Lightroom Classic, you guys will remember, or you should have remembered, that I added or imported some images into Lightroom on my phone from my camera roll. And now you see in Classic now those images just popped up. So here are the 4 or 5 or 6 images, okay? The key to this happening is, number one, you need to have your Classic catalog syncing to the cloud. And so up here in the top right-hand corner of my screen, right there, if I click on that, you'll see that it is syncing because it says local activity synced, and there's a pause button here. If it says pause, that means pause syncing. If your catalog says start syncing, then you have to turn it on to have the syncing enabled. What that means is that all images that you have in your Lightroom app on your phone or your iPad, those automatically sync to the cloud. If you turn on syncing in Lightroom Classic, they get synced into your Lightroom Classic catalog. Now, I went over this in the last webinar that we did back in early November, but there's just two things here that you want to be mindful of. Number one, if I go up into the Lightroom Classic settings, or I'm sorry, preferences, perhaps call settings in Windows or preferences, but that would be, this is on the Mac, this is in your Lightroom Classic menu, on the Windows, I think it's in the file menu. If you go into your preferences, you'll see here one of the tabs says Lightroom Sync. And if you have this turned on, right here, it says location, specify location for Lightroom's synced images. If you have that turned on the way I do, that means that any images that get synced from the cloud will also get downloaded to your hard drive or your destination of choice. And you see here that I have this turned on and I have it syncing to a network drive that I have, but it could be any local drive or your internal drive. The point is, it should be the same place that you're keeping all of your RAW files that you are importing from your cameras. So this is going to the same place. This next checkbox here allows me to create subfolders, if you will. But this means that when I sync to the cloud, these 5 images now, not only have I synced them, but I've also downloaded the original RAW files. So they exist on my computer or on my external hard drive. They also exist in the cloud. But let's say that I want to remove them from the cloud so that I free up that space. Okay? The way I would do that is I would, and by the way, in Lightroom Classic here on the left, you see that I have all photographs, and then the second view that we have is all synced photographs. So all photographs is my catalog, everything in my catalog. The second one is called all synced photographs, and this is just the images that I'm syncing to the cloud. Okay, so this is a subset of my main catalog because you see it only has 1,700 images. Roughly, my main catalog has 61,000 plus. Now, if I want to remove those images from the cloud to free up that space, but still maintain the RAW files, I'm going to select all 6 of these images. Actually, I'm going to click the first one, hold down Shift, and click this one. Now you see that I've got 6 images selected, and I'm going to right-click and then come down to the bottom. I'm going to say Remove from all synced photographs. When I select that, it's going to ask me, usually I have this turned off, but I left it on, 6 photos will be removed from all synced collections and from Lightroom photos on the cloud, on Creative Cloud, but will not be deleted from your desktop catalog. I'm going to click on OK. And now you see in all synced photographs, those images are no longer there. That means that they have now been removed from the cloud, deleted, but because I synced them with that checkbox in the settings set to make sure you download all the images, I still have them. And the way I know is because if I come and select all photographs instead of all synced photographs, there are my images. So they now exist in my catalog, if you will, with everything else. And I've got the RAW files because if I right-click on one of these images and select Show in Finder, there's the RAW file right there. Now, let's say that we want to put this image back on the cloud so that I can see it in Lightroom and on my iPad, or if you're using a Lightroom desktop. Because right now, if I open up my iPhone, if I were to open my iPhone now, those images would not appear because we removed them from the cloud. And so that deleted them from the cloud, and Lightroom shows me everything that's on my Lightroom on the iPhone app shows me everything that's in the cloud. Let's say I wanted to put these images back. Well, I'm going to select all of them again. I'm going to click and drag them back into all synced photographs, and you get that little plus sign. And now they're added back to the cloud. But here is the very important and key difference. And that is that when I add them back to the cloud, I am not re-uploading the RAW files. It's just adding back smart previews of those files. And smart previews are a special file that Lightroom creates that is essentially a very compressed version of your original RAW file. It's a small, very small compressed version of the RAW file that still gives you editing capability. And so I've added them back to all sync photographs. How do I know? Because if I come now and click on all sync photographs again, there are the images. They're back, but they're not back as full RAW files. And here is the second advantage, is that they take no space on my cloud storage. So when you add images back as smart previews, it doesn't use up any of your storage space. So I essentially have the basic Lightroom plan, 20 gigs, which is, you know, $10 a month. It's going to go up soon, but whatever it is. And you see that I have 1,700 plus images on my in the cloud, and yet my cloud storage is like 2 gigs. Okay, so that's how you do that. You have to first remove them from the cloud, and then you can add them back in Classic as smart previews. And when I say add them back as smart previews, you don't have to like select the smart preview. That's just the way they're added back. When you take an image and you put it back into the cloud, it only adds the smart preview by default. You cannot actually add back the original RAW file in Lightroom Classic. Okay, I know that can be a little confusing because we're talking about multiple apps. In case you've heard of Lightroom Desktop, there are many different moving parts here going on with the workflow. But just to keep things simple for now, that's my basic workflow. I take pictures with my phone, or import them on my phone if I took them with the built-in app. Then I open up Classic. I remove them from all sync photographs so that I'm taking them out, the original RAWs, I'm taking them out from the cloud after they've downloaded, after they've successfully synced. So the way you know that you've synced them is that up here it'll say synced. And if you're syncing for the first time where you've imported like 30 images, that it'll be syncing for a little while. That means that it's pulling down all the original RAW files. Once you've completely synced, then you can go ahead and remove them from all sync photographs. That takes them off the cloud. I mean, you could leave them in the cloud if you wanted to. The problem is that if you leave them in the cloud, that's going to count against your storage, and you're going to get to the point where you're going to fill up your storage because you're just taking images on your phone and it's just uploading the RAW files. And then you're either going to have to buy more storage from Adobe if you wanted to, or you're going to have to clear some images out. And so this prevents you from essentially ever filling up your storage. So yeah, I think that pretty much covers everything that I wanted to talk about today. Let me see if there are any other questions here that I can answer for you. Brad, yes, we did email Brad a while back, but hopefully this cleared things up for you. Lightroom Classic covered in depth in your Lightroom course. Paul, yeah, so I don't really cover this much in my Lightroom Masterclass. The Lightroom Masterclass is more about Lightroom itself. It's using Classic. I don't cover it so much in the whole syncing workflow. I have covered it in depth in the Academy, several sessions where we get into all the specifics of it, but I hope to be releasing something later this month where I'm just going to cover this in just a separate course for those who want to just get more information on that. Because I didn't even talk about Lightroom Desktop, which is another app that you can have on your computer, which essentially is kind of like the iOS version of Lightroom, but on your desktop, which also shows you your images from the cloud. And again, that is useful. I think it's useful to learn because then it allows you to be more comfortable editing your images on your iPad, for example, because the interface is the same. Whereas the Classic interface, you're only going to find the Classic interface in one place, and that's in Lightroom Classic on your desktop. It's nowhere in terms of the mobile apps. So what are the advantages of using the Pro camera? The basic advantages are that the Pro camera app, I think, gives you, it's a better UI. Let me switch over real quick and I'll just give you a quick 10-second tour because, again, we can be here for a while. But if I go back and turn on my phone, if I open up Pro Camera, which is right there, you'll see that the interface is a little different. It's a little more intuitive for me. So automatically you get the exposure adjustment at the bottom. Automatically you get at the top, you see your exposure adjustments in a clearer kind of interface. I can see my shutter speed, I can see my exposure, I can see my ISO. And if I tap this little icon here, that enables the timer. And if I tap the little 9 dots there, then you get easy access to different settings. So for example, whether I'm shooting in ProRAW or JPEG, or whether I'm shooting in straight RAW. So you get all the functionality that the other two apps provide. You can also change, things like black and white, whether I want to see things in black and white. It's just an interface for the most part thing. The interface is just clearer for me, and I like the way the app is designed. That's basically it. But I would recommend, if you're just getting started, if you're comfortable with the iPhone, then experiment with some apps. There's another one called Halide, Halide Mark II, which is also very good. I've used it. I slightly prefer Pro Camera, but it's neither here nor there, because it's more a question of what you're comfortable with. They're all going to give you the same essential quality because they're all using the same hardware. But if you're just getting started with the iPhone and you want keep the options down, I personally would strongly recommend the built-in camera app. And if you've got a Lightroom subscription, I think you have to install that, because that then allows you to leverage what Lightroom is giving you, what you're paying for, to move your images into Classic. And that creates a nice little workflow where I go out, I take pictures with my iPhone, it syncs, I come on my desktop, it's there, I edit it just like anything else, I add it to collections, I can share it with friends, I can print it out. So it makes the iPhone, brings it into kind of my regular workflow, if you will. Just takes a little setting up and a little thinking about how to get all the parts working. But hopefully this has helped you a little bit today. Yes, so ProRAW, the ProRAW format. I'm answering Dave, who asked about the ProRAW and Pro Camera. The ProRAW format by Apple is the one that has the computational photography, and Pro Camera gives you access to ProRAW. That's when I showed you you can set it to ProRAW. So yeah, it definitely gives you that. I don't think I would use it if it didn't give you access to that as well. All right, so I think that pretty much does it. I think hopefully I've answered all your questions. Thank you all again for joining me today. It's been a lot of fun, and hopefully I answered everything. Oops, let me turn this off. My mistake. There we go. Sorry about that. That's what it feels like. Feels like our phones are more important these days than we are, particularly with kids, but that's a whole other topic. Hopefully I've answered all your questions. If you got any other questions, please reach out. There'll be a recording available. You can always feel free to email me, and I'll be happy to answer it in any way I can. And hopefully we can talk about this again in the future, because there are many more options to talk about. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great rest of your New Year's Day, and we'll see you soon. Take care.